The stage was set for what was expected to be one of the most explosive interviews of the year. The bright studio lights illuminated the sleek, modern set of the LTV night show, where anticipation crackled in the air like static electricity. The audience, a mix of skeptics, supporters, and the simply curious, sat on the edge of their seats, waiting to witness what would unfold. Tonight's guest was none other than Donald J. Trump, the former President of the United States and a man who had long been a polarizing figure in American politics and media. At the center of the stage, two chairs faced each other under the relentless focus of the cameras. Sitting in one was Matthew Johnson, the sharp-witted, ambitious host known for his confrontational style and his ability to stir controversy. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, Johnson exuded confidence, fully expecting to dominate the conversation. This was his moment, a chance to make headlines and push Trump into a corner. Then, from the side of the stage, Donald Trump entered, his presence commanding immediate attention. The familiar blonde hair, the unmistakable black suit and bold red tie, and his signature walk filled with confidence, no introduction was needed. The audience reacted in a mixed chorus, some cheered, others watched in silence, waiting for the fireworks to begin. Trump took his seat, leaning back slightly, his arms crossed as he studied Johnson. The host adjusted his microphone, flashed a well-practiced smile, and glanced down at the script before him. He knew the public was expecting a bombshell moment, and he had just the question to make it happen. As the interview began, Matthew Johnson wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter. He had prepared for this moment, knowing that a single well-placed question could dominate headlines for weeks. With a smirk and an air of confidence, he set down his script and looked Trump straight in the eye. "Let's get straight to it," Johnson said, his voice steady. "There's a question millions of people have been asking. Have you ever taken a DNA test for Barron Trump?" The words hung in the air like a live wire, sending a shockwave through the studio. The audience, which had been buzzing with anticipation, fell into a stunned silence. The cameras zoomed in on Trump's face, capturing every twitch, every movement. The moment had arrived, Johnson's big play. But Donald Trump didn't flinch. He didn't lean forward in anger or look caught off guard. Instead, he sat there, calm, composed, and unshaken. He stared at Johnson, his expression unreadable. "Do you even realize what you just said?" Trump asked slowly, his voice carrying a weight that made the entire studio hold its breath. Johnson chuckled, maintaining his composure. "I'm just asking a question that the public wants to know. Many have raised suspicions. So that's the purpose of your show?" Trump interrupted, his voice sharper now. "To question the legitimacy of a 17-year-old boy just because the media has nothing else to hold on to?" A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Some nodded in agreement, while others waited to see how the host would respond. But before Johnson could regain control, a sudden noise came from the back of the studio, one that would change the course of the interview completely. Just as the tension in the studio reached its peak, a sudden disturbance came from the back row. A murmur spread through the audience as heads turned toward the source of the noise. There, standing nervously, was a middle-aged woman clutching a worn-out handbag so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her face was pale, her lips trembling as if she had something to say but was afraid to speak. Donald Trump, who had just finished challenging Matthew Johnson's line of questioning, shifted his gaze toward her. The entire studio followed. The woman hesitated for a moment, swallowing hard, before finally speaking. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice breaking. Matthew Johnson raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting this interruption. "And you are?" he asked, trying to maintain control over the situation. The woman took a deep breath, her voice shaking but resolute. "My name is Sarah Anderson," she said, tears beginning to roll down her face. "And I never meant to offend your family, Mr. Trump. I was desperate." Trump narrowed his eyes slightly, studying her with curiosity rather than judgment. "Desperate for what?" he asked, his tone noticeably softer than before. Sarah hesitated again, looking down at the thick manila folder she had been holding so tightly. Finally, as if unable to contain it any longer, she spoke. "My son, Tommy, is 14 years old and already over 6 feet 4 inches. He's growing too fast, and doctors say he might have a rare condition. But I can't afford the genetic tests he needs." Her voice cracked, and she shook her head in frustration. "I sent this question to the show, not to attack your family, Mr. Trump, but because I didn't know where else to turn." A hush fell over the studio. The question that had been meant to stir scandal was now exposing something far more real, an American mother's struggle to provide for her child's medical needs. Trump remained silent for a moment, processing what she had just said. Matthew Johnson, realizing that the situation was slipping from his control, tried to steer the conversation back to his intended narrative. "Can we return to the main topic?" Johnson interjected quickly. "We're here to discuss Barron Trump." But Trump didn't take his eyes off Sarah. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if piecing something together. Then, he turned back to Johnson with an expression that was both firm and knowing. "Oh, I think we're talking about something much more important now." Johnson froze. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted dramatically. The audience, once waiting for political drama, was now fully engaged in something more meaningful. Sarah stood there, vulnerable yet courageous, embodying the real struggles of countless American families. Trump reached under the table and pulled out a thick folder. He held it up for the audience to see before setting it down in front of him. "I know about Tommy's case," he said firmly. "And I know about many other children like him." Gasps rippled across the studio. Johnson's mouth opened slightly in shock. Trump flipped open the file. "3 months ago, when this question was submitted to your show, I had it investigated. Not for a scandal, but because I wanted to know why a mother would ask something like this on national television." He began reading aloud from the documents. Tommy's medical records. Doctor visits. Total hospital bills, $147,800. His family has seen 17 specialists. They've sold their car. Taken on 3 extra jobs. All just to survive. Sarah covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Trump turned his gaze back to the audience. "And do you know what we did?" He let the question hang for a moment before answering it himself. "The Trump Foundation paid off Tommy's medical bills last week." The studio erupted. Some audience members gasped audibly, while others started clapping. Sarah sobbed uncontrollably, overcome with emotion. The weight she had been carrying for so long was suddenly lifted. Matthew Johnson sat motionless. This wasn't how the interview was supposed to go. Trump leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "So now, let's really talk about DNA," he said, his voice unwavering. "But not the way you wanted to." Johnson was visibly rattled. He had entered the interview expecting to put Trump on the defensive, to generate controversy and gain ratings. But instead, he had just witnessed something profoundly different, a moment of true leadership, of genuine compassion. The audience watched in stunned silence, waiting for what would happen next. The energy in the studio had shifted entirely. What had started as an attempt to corner Donald Trump with a controversial question had now become something much bigger. Matthew Johnson, the usually unshakable host, was struggling to maintain control. His planned attack on Trump had unraveled in real time, and now, he was staring at an audience that no longer seemed interested in scandal. Instead, they were witnessing something raw, something real, a moment that went beyond politics, beyond ratings, and straight into the heart of the American struggle. Donald Trump sat at the center of it all, his expression firm but composed. He didn't bask in the applause. He didn't gloat over the fact that he had just upended Johnson's entire game plan. Instead, he stayed focused. There was still more to say. He turned back to the folder in front of him and flipped through the pages. 3 months ago, when this question about Barron was submitted, I had it looked into," he repeated, making sure every word landed. "Not because I was worried about my son. But because I was worried about why someone would ask it in the first place." He held up one of the documents from the folder. Tommy's medical records. The visits, the tests, the bills. $147,800 in debt, just to try and keep a child healthy. And here's the real story, Matthew. Here's what the media won't tell you. He let the weight of his words settle before continuing. The Trump Foundation paid off Tommy's medical bills last week. No cameras. No press releases. No political speeches. Just action. The audience erupted again. It wasn't just applause, it was an emotional release. People weren't just clapping, they were wiping their eyes, shaking their heads in disbelief. The narrative had shifted entirely. Matthew Johnson, still seated across from Trump, looked visibly shaken. This was not how the interview was supposed to go. He had prepared to catch Trump off guard, to expose something that would dominate news cycles for days. Instead, he had been caught in his own trap. He tried to recover. "Mr. Trump," he began, forcing himself to speak, "while it's commendable that your foundation helped this family, the public still has questions. Don't you think?" Trump raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No, Matthew," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "No more games." The studio fell silent again. "You tried to turn a legitimate concern into a scandal for ratings," Trump continued, his gaze never leaving Johnson. "But that's not the truth, is it? The truth is, the Trump Foundation has been working behind the scenes for years to help families like the Andersons. Families that you and your network would never take the time to understand, let alone help." Johnson shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. The audience could feel the power dynamic changing. This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was something else, something bigger. Trump leaned forward, his voice steady but intense. "You want to talk about DNA, Matthew? Fine. Let's talk about it. But let's talk about the real DNA of this country, the DNA of the hardworking men and women who are doing everything they can to keep their families afloat while people like you chase headlines." The audience burst into applause once again. Johnson was speechless. Trump didn't stop there. He pulled out more papers from the folder, holding them up for the cameras. "This isn't just about Tommy," he said. "This is about hundreds of families just like his. Families drowning in medical debt. Parents working 2, 3 jobs just to afford basic care for their children. And while people like you sit here trying to create scandals, people like us are out there actually helping." Sarah Anderson, still standing in the back row, was openly crying now. But these weren't just tears of desperation anymore, they were tears of relief, of gratitude, of finally being seen. Trump turned back to Johnson. "So tell me, Matthew," he said, his tone almost challenging, "what exactly have you done to help these families? What has your network done besides push more division, more outrage, more noise?" Johnson opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had nothing to say. The studio was no longer on his side. The audience that had once been waiting for a juicy scandal was now witnessing something far more powerful. A man who had been painted as self-serving and controversial was proving, in real time, that he was willing to step up when it mattered. Trump sat back in his chair, letting the silence speak for itself. Finally, Sarah Anderson, the woman whose question had started it all, took a shaky step forward. "Mr. Trump," she said, her voice trembling but strong, "I never expected anything like this. I just wanted someone to hear me." Trump looked at her with a softness that was rarely seen on television. "You don't need to thank me," he said simply. "You just need to know that you're not alone in this." Sarah nodded, holding her folder tightly against her chest. The audience, now fully behind Trump, started clapping again. But this time, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about winning or losing an interview. It was about something far greater, the realization that real leadership isn't about words, it's about actions. Matthew Johnson, visibly defeated, tried one last time to regain control. But Mr. Trump, the public still has questions about your family, about Barron, about. Trump didn't even let him finish. You can keep pushing your narrative, Matthew, he said, his voice unwavering, but the truth is what stands. The Trump family doesn't need to prove anything to you. We've proven ourselves with actions, not words. He turned toward the camera, looking directly at the millions watching at home. And for all the families out there like Tommy's, for the parents struggling to get their kids the care they need, don't let the noise distract you. We see you. We hear you. And we're not going anywhere. The studio erupted into applause, louder than before. The energy had completely transformed. Matthew Johnson sat in stunned silence, knowing that he had lost. The narrative had been rewritten, not by controversy, but by something far more powerful. Truth. Action. Leadership. As the studio settled into an intense silence, Matthew Johnson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His once confident smirk had disappeared, replaced by a forced neutrality that barely masked his unease. He had walked into this interview expecting to control the narrative, to put Donald Trump on the defensive. Instead, Trump had flipped the script entirely. Trump leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but firm. Let's be honest here, Matthew. This isn't really about Barron, is it? It's not even about me. It's about what the media does to people like Sarah Anderson, to families like hers, to anyone who doesn't fit into the scandal you want to create. Johnson opened his mouth to respond, but Trump held up a hand to silence him. You see, this is the problem, Trump continued, turning slightly to address the audience as well as the camera. The media today isn't about the truth. It's not about facts. It's about ratings. It's about clicks. It's about taking something that should be a personal, private matter and turning it into entertainment. And for what? To sell ad space. To get more views. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement. Others, loyal to the media's version of events, looked uncertain. Trump gestured toward Sarah Anderson, who was still holding her manila folder, tears drying on her cheeks. Sarah didn't come here to create a scandal, he said. She came here because she was desperate, because she didn't know where else to turn. And what did your network do, Matthew? You took her fear, her struggle, and you tried to turn it into a gotcha moment for ratings. Johnson cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control. Mr. Trump, I think we should clarify something. Trump shook his head. No, we don't need to clarify anything. The truth is already clear. Instead of actually looking into the struggles of real Americans, you tried to create a spectacle. Instead of asking why so many families can't afford healthcare, you chose to ask me about my son's DNA. The tension in the room was now palpable. The audience was no longer just watching an interview, they were witnessing something bigger, something that hit home for many of them. The shift was undeniable. Trump continued, his voice never wavering. The real disconnect in this country isn't between the rich and the poor, or between Democrats and Republicans. It's between the people who actually do something and the people who sit in studios, like you, Matthew, pretending to care while they push controversy for views. The words hit like a hammer. Johnson's composure cracked slightly. He opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. Trump wasn't finished. He pulled another document from his folder and held it up for the cameras. This is a list of just some of the families the Trump Foundation has helped over the last few years, he said. No press conferences, no media coverage. Just action. And while your network was busy trying to manufacture another scandal, we were busy making a difference. The crowd stirred again. Some audience members even started clapping softly. Johnson finally managed to regain his voice. Mr. Trump, isn't it fair to say that your foundation's work still benefits your public image? That this is still, in some way, about politics? Trump let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it. Matthew, if I cared about public image, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. The audience chuckled. The media loves to say I only do things for PR, but let me ask you something, where's your network when families like Sarah's need help? Where's your network when kids like Tommy are struggling to get the healthcare they need? Nowhere. Because that doesn't sell ads, does it? Johnson had no response. Trump turned back to the audience, his voice unwavering. You want to know why people don't trust the media anymore? It's because of moments like this. It's because people see through the lies, the spin, the manufactured outrage. They're tired of the games. They want solutions. They want action. And they can tell the difference between someone who actually cares and someone who's just looking for the next headline. The studio was now fully engaged. The audience, even those who might not have come in as Trump supporters, was feeling the impact of what they were witnessing. This was no longer about politics, it was about truth versus manipulation. Trump leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch for a moment. Then, he delivered the final blow. You want to talk about Barron? Fine. Here's the truth, my son is a good kid. He's smart, he's kind, and he's strong. And he doesn't deserve to have his name dragged into your circus just because you need another story. So, no, Matthew, I'm not going to give you your scandal. What I'm going to do instead is keep doing what I've always done, helping real Americans, whether the cameras are rolling or not. The audience erupted into applause, louder than before. This wasn't just clapping out of politeness, it was real, unfiltered approval. Matthew Johnson sat motionless, knowing he had lost control of the narrative. His plan to create controversy had backfired spectacularly. Trump turned toward the camera, delivering one final message. To all the families out there struggling, to the parents like Sarah who are doing everything they can for their kids, don't let the noise distract you. We see you. We hear you. And we're not going anywhere. The studio exploded with applause, some audience members even standing. Trump had not only defended himself, he had exposed the media's game for what it was. Johnson, still seated, looked defeated. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing his moment of realization. He hadn't just lost an interview, he had lost the trust of the people watching. And as the applause continued, Trump sat back in his chair, calm, composed, and victorious. Just as the energy in the studio reached a fever pitch, the screens behind Donald Trump suddenly flickered to life. The camera zoomed in, capturing the audience's puzzled expressions as they turned their attention to the large screen above the stage. Then, a familiar face appeared, Barron Trump. At just 17 years old, Barron had been largely kept out of the political spotlight. Yet here he was, standing tall and composed, his presence commanding the attention of millions watching from home. He wasn't a politician, nor was he someone who had ever sought the public's attention. But now, in the midst of an interview designed to scrutinize his existence, he had something to say. Hey, Tommy, Barron's voice came through, clear and steady. I heard you're part of the Tall Kids Club too. Don't worry, we've got your back. It was just one simple sentence, but the impact was immediate. The studio, which had moments ago been filled with tension and controversy, now held an entirely different atmosphere. A hush fell over the crowd, not out of discomfort but out of sheer emotion. It was a moment that transcended politics, a moment that no one had expected. Sarah Anderson, the mother whose desperation had led her to ask the initial question, gasped softly. She clutched her chest, overwhelmed by the fact that Barron Trump himself had taken the time to acknowledge her son. Her eyes filled with fresh tears, not of fear or anxiety this time, but of gratitude and validation. Matthew Johnson, the host who had been so confident in his ability to control the narrative, shifted in his seat uncomfortably. His plan had been to corner Donald Trump, to create a spectacle out of a scandal that didn't exist. Instead, he had inadvertently given the Trump family the perfect stage to demonstrate something far more powerful: authenticity, empathy, and action over words. Donald Trump, watching his son on the screen, nodded approvingly. He had never needed Barron to defend him. But this? This was something different. This was a young man who had grown up in the eye of a storm, choosing to step forward, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a simple message of support. The audience slowly started to react, first with murmurs and then with applause. It wasn't the same kind of applause from earlier, the kind driven by political division or ideological support. This was genuine, the kind of applause reserved for moments that resonate on a human level. Trump turned to Johnson, his expression unreadable. "There's your answer, Matthew," he said. "It's not about DNA. It's about what you do when it really matters." Johnson was speechless. He had nothing left. The conversation had been taken out of his hands. This was no longer his interview. It was something much bigger. Barron Trump's presence on the screen wasn't political. It wasn't rehearsed. It was a simple act of kindness, a teenage boy reaching out to another teenage boy who needed to hear that he wasn't alone. That was something Matthew Johnson had never expected. The audience reaction continued to build. Some people wiped tears from their eyes, others simply nodded in agreement, acknowledging what had just happened. For once, it wasn't about left or right, Democrat or Republican, it was about people. Sarah Anderson took a hesitant step forward, still clutching her folder. She looked up at the screen, at Barron's face, then turned to Trump. Her voice shook as she spoke. "I never thought anyone would listen to us," she whispered. "I never thought anyone would care." Trump looked at her, his expression softer now. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he said. "Too many people out there feel the same way. They're struggling, and no one listens. That's why we do what we do. That's why we step in." Sarah nodded, unable to hold back the tears anymore. But this time, they weren't just tears of struggle, they were tears of relief. Johnson cleared his throat, still trying to find a way to regain control. "Well, Mr. Trump, I think." Trump cut him off. "No, Matthew, I think we're done here." The words hung in the air. And for the first time in his career, Matthew Johnson had no comeback. The applause in the studio grew louder, this time turning into a standing ovation. The entire audience was now on its feet, some clapping, others cheering. For all the years of political division, for all the scandals that had dominated headlines, for all the media narratives that had tried to pit people against one another, this moment was different. This was a moment of unity. The cameras zoomed in on Barron Trump's face once more before the screen slowly faded to black. The last thing the audience saw was his small, reassuring smile, a simple but powerful message that, for once, everyone in the room could agree on. As the interview wrapped up, the energy in the studio had transformed completely. What started as an attempt to corner Donald Trump had turned into something far more significant, a moment of clarity, of leadership, and of genuine human connection. The crowd, which had initially come expecting political theater, was now left contemplating something deeper. Matthew Johnson, the once dominant host known for pushing boundaries and controlling narratives, sat visibly defeated. His carefully planned strategy to provoke a controversy had not only failed but had completely backfired. Instead of painting Trump as evasive or defensive, he had given him a platform to showcase compassion, decisiveness, and action, qualities that resonated far beyond partisan politics. The shift in public perception was immediate. Social media exploded within minutes of the broadcast's conclusion. Hashtags like #RealLeadership, #TrumpFoundation, and #ActionsOverWords began trending worldwide. Americans, regardless of their political leanings, found themselves re-evaluating the narratives they had been fed about Donald Trump. One particularly viral post read, "I never thought I'd say this, but tonight changed my perspective. Trump didn't just talk, he acted. Meanwhile, the media keeps chasing headlines instead of real problems. Maybe it's time we rethink who the real leaders are. Others shared stories of their own struggles with healthcare, financial hardship, and the difficulty of being heard in a system that often prioritizes controversy over solutions. For Sarah Anderson and her son Tommy, the impact was life-changing. That night, as they sat together watching the interview replay on TV, the reality of what had just happened finally sank in. "I can't believe this," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "People are actually listening. For the first time in years, I feel like we're not alone." Tommy, still wide-eyed from everything that had unfolded, simply nodded. "It's not just us, Mom," he said. "This is bigger than us." Indeed, it was bigger. Across the country, families who had felt abandoned, overlooked, or exploited by the media began to see things differently. It wasn't about left or right, Republican or Democrat, it was about who was actually making a difference. Meanwhile, Matthew Johnson and his network faced an entirely different reality. While the interview had undoubtedly drawn millions of viewers, it wasn't the gotcha moment they had hoped for. Instead, it had exposed the media's obsession with drama over real issues. Ratings had been high, but credibility had been shattered. Behind the scenes, Johnson knew what this meant. He had built his career on crafting viral, sensationalized moments, but this time, he had lost control of the narrative. The public wasn't rallying around his question. They weren't dissecting Trump's response about Barron. They were talking about Tommy, about families like Sarah's, about real struggles that actually mattered. For the first time in his career, Johnson found himself on the defensive. In a follow-up discussion the next day, media analysts struggled to spin the interview in a way that fit their usual narratives. Some called it Trump dodging tough questions, while others attempted to downplay the impact of the Trump Foundation's actions. But the public wasn't buying it. People weren't just listening to the media anymore, they were thinking for themselves. One commentator on a major news network admitted, "Whether you like him or not, you can't deny what Trump did last night. He turned a hostile interview into a moment of unity. And that's something we don't see often in today's America." In the following weeks, donations to the Trump Foundation skyrocketed. Families reached out, sharing their struggles, hoping that someone, anyone, would listen. And unlike the media, Trump and his team took action. His message was simple. The media wants to divide us. But the truth? The truth is that we're stronger when we help each other. And that's exactly what we're going to do. For millions of Americans, that was a message that finally made sense. For Matthew Johnson and the media establishment, however, it was a wake-up call they never saw coming. The ripple effects of the interview were felt far beyond the studio. What had started as a calculated attempt to corner Donald Trump had instead ignited a national conversation about media ethics, leadership, and real action. For years, the American public had been bombarded with sensationalized headlines, carefully edited sound bites, and news cycles that prioritized controversy over substance. But this time, things felt different. People weren't talking about the scandal Matthew Johnson had tried to create. They were talking about Tommy's story, about families like Sarah Anderson's, and about the Trump Foundation's work that had largely gone unnoticed. The media, which had long shaped narratives with ease, suddenly found themselves on the defensive. Social media became the battleground for this shift. While some outlets scrambled to frame the interview as Trump dodging a tough question, the overwhelming public response told a different story. The hashtags #RealLeadership, #Trump Foundation, and #actions over words continued trending, with thousands of Americans sharing their own experiences of struggling to afford healthcare, working multiple jobs, and feeling abandoned by the very institutions meant to help them. One viral tweet summed it up perfectly. "For years, I believed everything the media told me about Trump. But after last night, I have to admit, he's actually out here helping people, while the media just chases clicks. Makes you think." Meanwhile, Matthew Johnson's career took a serious hit. What was supposed to be his defining moment, a hard-hitting interview that would cement his reputation, had instead exposed him as part of the problem. People weren't impressed with his tactics. They saw him for what he was, a media figure more concerned with spectacle than solutions. Even within his own network, executives were beginning to rethink their approach. Ratings were important, but they were beginning to realize that the public's trust was slipping. Audiences weren't just blindly accepting the narratives they were being fed anymore. They were asking questions, demanding proof, and recognizing when they were being manipulated. For Donald Trump, however, the moment was a victory, but not in the way his critics assumed. He hadn't come to that interview to win a debate. He had come to defend his family and set the record straight. But more importantly, he had used the opportunity to shift the focus from scandal to real problems, something the media had failed to do for years. At a rally a few days later, Trump addressed the interview. "They wanted to talk about me. They wanted to talk about my son. But we turned it around, didn't we? We made it about something real. About helping people. About action." The crowd roared in agreement. For millions of Americans, the message had finally broken through the noise. This wasn't just about Donald Trump versus the media. This was about a country waking up to the truth, that real leadership isn't about headlines. It's about what you do when no one's watching. As the cameras zoomed in for the final moments of the interview, Donald Trump leaned forward, his voice steady and unwavering. This wasn't just another televised debate or media-driven controversy. This was a defining moment about what real leadership looked like. To all the families out there who are struggling, whether it's with medical bills, with work, with your future, I want you to know that you're not alone, Trump said, looking straight into the camera. We hear you. And we are doing everything we can to make sure you get the help you need. It was a simple message, but one that resonated deeply. In a time when the media was focused on drama, scandal, and division, Trump was talking about solutions, real people, and real action. Matthew Johnson, still sitting across from him, looked completely defeated. He had come into this interview believing he had control, that he could push Trump into a corner. Instead, Trump had flipped the narrative entirely, turning the spotlight away from himself and onto the people who actually needed it. The audience, once divided, was now united in understanding. Many had entered the room expecting a media spectacle, but what they had witnessed was something much bigger, a leader who didn't just talk about making a difference, but actually took action. As the studio lights dimmed and the interview came to a close, it was clear that this was not the end of a conversation, it was the beginning of a movement. A movement that valued action over words, truth over headlines, and leadership over spectacle. The most powerful takeaway from this story is the importance of action over words. In today's world, where media thrives on controversy and social media amplifies every scandal, it's easy to get caught up in narratives that distract from real issues. This interview was a perfect example of how the focus can shift from meaningless speculation to real-world impact when someone chooses to take action instead of engaging in drama. Donald Trump didn't just defend himself, he redirected the conversation to something that actually mattered. Instead of allowing the media to control the narrative, he used the moment to help a family in need and shine a light on the struggles of everyday Americans. That's a lesson we can all apply. Don't just talk about making a difference, do something that actually changes lives. In our own lives, whether at work, in our communities, or in personal relationships, we often face situations where people focus more on criticizing, debating, or creating drama rather than taking meaningful action. The best way to rise above that? Stay focused on solutions, lead with integrity, and let your actions speak louder than words. Real leadership isn't about winning arguments, it's about making an impact.